Well, it's not enough that I'm going to have one farewell sermon. It's not enough that I'm going to have two. I'm going to have, in all my grandiosity, three. But, it gives me a chance to think about things I would like to communicate to you as I walk out the door and head to my next exciting opportunity. And I thought, well, what might be valuable to share with you? And I'd like to start off today talking about a subject that deals not only with this congregation, but with the whole Unitarian Universalist movement in America, and certainly the congregations in the Southeast. Let me begin by saying that we need to think about the importance of context to a congregation, especially a congregation like this, especially as it begins to form its identity and character and spirit in its initial stages. Because to some extent, a congregation is going to be a reaction to the culture and society around it as they understand it and as they define it. And a congregation like this is going to see itself as something that addresses or deals with or responds to the context around it. That is certainly true for every UU congregation I know that sprouted up in the Southeast during the 50s and the 60s. And one of the major points I want to try to make today is that the context in which this congregation arose is radically different from the context in which you currently reside, both in the small scale around you and in the larger scale around you. This congregation was formed to a certain extent as a refuge from the society that surrounded the people here, a place where they could go and be truly themselves in a society that suppressed or would suppress aspects of themselves that they could let be expressed here. Many UU congregations in the Southeast particularly, but all through the country, really sprung to life, and in some cases literally emerged from nothing in the 1950s and the 1960s. Certainly all UU congregations in this country had a growth spurt in the 1950s and the 1960s, and to a certain extent in the 1970s. Even though our religious movement, as you know if you went to my class a couple of weeks ago, sprung from the Reformation 5 centuries ago, nevertheless, the character of our congregations was forged in the 50s and in the 60s. And in the process, an identity, a style of thinking, a way of understanding itself was created during that time. And so it became part of the consciousness of people, or even the unconscious of people, that we were on the edges of society. We were varying degrees of radical. We were free thinkers. We embraced ideas that a lot of people did not, and that we were definitely different from the mainstream. The congregation, this one and many like it, thought of itself in that way and reacted to the community and behaved toward the community based on these perceptions. That way of thinking still persists and permeates today in the thinking of people who are leaders and members of the congregation. However, right now, the environment we are in is radically different from the environment of the 50s and 60s and 70s. But in many ways, we have not adjusted our thinking, or we've adjusted it only lightly or moderately. And in many minds, we are stuck back in that world that existed decades ago. The new situation that exists right now has been in the making for decades. And this new situation is one of great opportunity for a religious community like this one, and will be both now and for decades to come. Now, let me look at some facts about the changes I am alluding to, but let me cite an experience that I had. About 17 years ago, I was doing some work for an interfaith community in Seattle, Washington. And I went to all of the major Protestant denominations in downtown Seattle, which had huge buildings. And I was going there to talk to the ministers or somebody on the staff about our ability, the interfaith group, to use some of their space. And in every single case, the minister said, "You can use any space you want. We barely have people on Sunday to fill these sanctuaries we have." And I walked into several of them, and they were much bigger than this space, and they had absolutely beautiful and ornate pulpits and furniture and whatnot, but they had fallen into disuse. And I was rather shocked because I had not been outside of my UU orbit, and I knew some kind of profound change was going on. So first of all, the first thing I want to point out that reflects our change situation is that many people are leaving so-called mainstream congregations in massive numbers. Meanwhile, the average age of people in these congregations is getting older and older. As that's happening, young people are not coming into the pews. An example is that most quintessential of Protestant congregations, the strongest many would consider, the most enduring many would consider, especially in the South, the Southern Baptist Church. Southern Baptist congregations have lost 500,000 members in 2022, the denomination's biggest one-year loss in more than a century. The Southern Baptist Convention, an umbrella group dominated by white conservatives, and one of the most influential religious groups, has shed 3% of its flock annually since the mid-2000s. And if we look at what is happening in society at large, here is what we see. Could you put up the first slide, please? So what we see is that there is a, oops, I better stop. There is a decline in the Christian group. Now let me talk a little bit about what that means. I better not move. Is that Christian really reflects the mainstream Protestant congregations generally. So some of these people may be liberal, some might be conservative, but they are decreasing in number. And the religiously unaffiliated is slowly getting larger. And other religions, very at the bottom, like Hindu, Buddhist, etc., is also slowly getting larger. But this chart you see assumes a rather static set of trends. Let's go to the second chart. So if switching continues and continues to accelerate, but brakes are applied to that acceleration, here's what will happen. The unaffiliated, the people who are simply leaving congregations, will grow and will outpace Christians, which is to say, people going to Protestant and Catholic congregations. But let's look at the third slide. If the acceleration rate continues as it is currently moving, that is, if the rate of change that we're now currently experiencing continues to change, then the numbers of Christians, i.e. people going to conventional Protestant and Catholic churches, will decline significantly, and the religiously unaffiliated will be the largest number. So you can take that down now. So one of the most critical groups is those non-affiliated. Let me broaden the definition of what that group refers to. The nones, as they're sometimes called, the N-O-N-E-S, refers to a demographic group characterized by their lack of affiliation with a religious group of any kind. They do not identify with a specific religious group or organized religious group, and they don't identify with a specific religious tradition. They include a wide range of views, including those who consider themselves spiritual but not religious, and they can also encompass individuals who actually have religious practices, do religious practices on a personal level, but do not associate with an organized religious group. They may, and they do indeed, contain a wide range of beliefs, ranging from skepticism to a more open-ended search for spiritual meaning. So a huge shift is going on. We don't know exactly what it means, but those charts I showed you reflect the fact that there is a huge change going on in our society in the way people think about religion and religious communities. And those trends that I've showed you are actually more accelerated the younger the group that's examined. There are reasons to believe that these changes could have huge significance for UU communities. I think, based on my own experience and my conversation with others, a large number of the nones, N-O-N-E-S group, would, I believe, be comfortable in a UU congregation if they actually got to know one. They would experience the pluralism that is available. Now, let me go to another set of data that will give more insight into the situation. And the information I showed you and the information I'm about to share with you comes from the Pew Research Center. Let's consider a few political issues, because UU congregations are very well known for their views about politics, and usually that is an important component of identity for UU congregations. I think a strong majority of UUs favor stronger gun control. Would you agree with that? So does a majority of the American public. Roughly 63% of this of the American population, 63%, say that they would like to see Congress pass another round of legislation to address gun violence. I think a majority of UUs disapprove of the overturning of Roe v. Wade. Would you agree with that? Yes. So does a majority of the public. 62% of Americans say a woman's right to choose should be legal in all or most cases. I believe UUs think climate change is real and that we need to become carbon neutral as a society. Would you agree with that idea? Yes. Amen. So does a majority of Americans. 69% favor the U.S. taking steps to become carbon neutral by 2050. The same share of Americans, 69%, say the U.S. should prioritize developing renewable energy sources such as wind and solar over expanding the production of oil, coal, and natural gas. I believe a majority of UUs believe transgender individuals should be protected from job discrimination. Would you agree with that? Yes. So does a majority of Americans. There you go. 64% of Americans favor policies that protect transgender individuals from discrimination in jobs, housing, public spaces, etc. Furthermore, all of the political views I have just expressed as being believed by the American public are intensified the younger the group of people you survey. So the younger the person, the more strongly held and pervasively held are these views. Now you might say, wait a minute, you've just said that the Pew Research Center and other places have said that Americans hold these views, but as I look at Congress, it certainly doesn't appear to be the case that the representatives, the fine representatives of the people reflect what the people want. Well, that is right. And that is, as we know, because Congress is controlled by special interests, which quite literally are not representing the majority views of the American people. It's an amazing thing, but it's a fact. You could look at state legislatures and so forth and say, well, they don't represent these views. Yes, that's true. Again, it's a case of skillful use of money by special interest. But the reality of what people in our country actually believe is very different from what our political leaders seem to reflect we believe. Powerful interest groups can persuade the people in power using money and political pressure, but those same people do not control or cannot control a local UU congregations. Now, based on the surveys I have shared, I think it is reasonable to believe that 30% of the American population holds views which would be compatible with a typical UU congregation. Would you disagree with that? I would say 30% based on the poll numbers that I just shared with you, based on the disaffection you saw in those charts pertaining to conventional religious congregations. Now, we are a country of 333 million people. 30% of 333 million is approximately 100 million people. That's a lot of people. But let's say that this 100 million population that we're theorizing would be compatible with us is inflated. Now, one of the reasons it could be inflated is that a certain percentage of people will never go to a church or synagogue or mosque or any religious institution. They just won't show up. They'd rather read the New York Times, etc. And there are a certain number of people of that 100 million who would have religious views that would not be compatible, even with a stretch, would not be compatible with a UU congregation. So let's say that this group that we've cut out of 100 million that we think would be compatible, let's say only 15% of that group is logically and reasonably compatible with a UU congregation. That would be 15% of nearly 100 million, which is 15 million people. That is not a crazy number to think about based on the reality of what I have just talked about. Now, how big do you think our denomination is? Any number you want to? You know, it matters whether the treasurer or the minister is counting the numbers. But I think somebody said 180. 150,000 is the most recent number I've heard. You know, I would lean towards that number. Somebody said 250,000. I said 2. That's what they like to report at GA or whatever. But you're a former treasurer. I know you come in with a low number, but the reality is around 200,000 maybe, because remember, there's also people who attend all the time who are not officially members, right? But who do go to church. Well, you are left with a number of 15 million people who are, one would believe, a reasonable pool of candidates to be attracted to a place like ours. There's a gap there between 200,000 and 15 million. We have been, because of that mentality I talked about earlier, we have been the least evangelical, if I might say that, religious movement in America. In fact, we almost try to hide our identity. And it has been like that for decades. And that is one reason why the gap exists. Now, I am working with an assumption. You may or may not have detected, yes.
How does the South reflect in your data? I mean, doesn't it make, there's a certain bias there in the South?
I agree, but here's the thing. When you're in a place like this, like you are right here, this is a fairly moderately, politically moderate place. But let me say this, is that I have been using an assumption in my remarks. The assumption is that people are going to gravitate toward a religious institution. If you look at the statistics about the nuns, about people that have just left the congregation and they're just out there floating, you get the idea that society is going to be atomized and people are going to live in their shells apart from one another. But I do not buy that. I think that if there were no such thing as a church, as an institution in our society, they would have to invent one, because people need a place where they can go to be among people who they can trust, who will give them help and support. People need to find a place where their spiritual yearnings, however you define that, can be satisfied. People need places where they feel fellowship and comfort. people need a place to help them and their families cope with the difficult struggles of every stage of life. People need a place where they can take their children and believe their children are learning some values that will help them live life more fully and morally and correctly and satisfyingly. So that is an underlying assumption. So all these people who are wandering in the wilderness outside of conventional congregations, I think that despite what appears to be a propensity to atomizing society and people just going to their separate places and not interacting with others, I think that's ultimately untrue for the human condition. Now, let me take this a little bit further. Wonder if there was a congregation that was open to these various religions that we saw running at a 12 or 13% trend. They were the low line, the Hindus, the Buddhists, etc. Wonder if there was a community that was open to them. Wonder if there was a community that was open to agnosticism and skepticism and the complete rejection of religion, as well as the embrace of religion. Wonder if there was a place that could take people who were alienated from traditional Christian churches, who still had a place of fondness in their heart for the story of Jesus and the importance of Jesus, but were just fed up with what they experienced elsewhere, but they could renew their vow, if you will, in a different way in a religious community. I wonder if there was a place where a community could address and satisfy and welcome all those different perspectives. Well, there is one. It's us. It's the UUs. So if you begin to think that way, you begin to see the real enormity of the potential. The Unitarian Universalists' long-term, centuries-old commitment to inclusiveness, individual freedom, reason, the embrace of science, and authentic spirituality, and the democratic process, characteristics that have very deep roots in our history and heritage, which then give us a diverse and evolving nature, is finally paying off in a big way. I think that's really what is happening. That in our society, our kind of way of being religious, or non-religious, if you will, has arrived at a cultural and societal point where we match the moment. We match the context of what's happening. There are a lot of opportunities confronting us. There's a lot of opportunities out there. Taking advantage of all of them is all in your hands. Thank you.